On Christmas morning, I opened the gift from my father and froze. Inside sat the restored camera I had given him exactly 1 year ago, my handwritten card still tucked in the pocket. For 32 years, I had been the invisible fixer for their perfect lives. As they laughed across the room, no one realized I had just been erased. That returned box was the moment I decided I would never save this family again. My name is Emery Davis. I am 32 years old, and I live in a quiet, modest house in the Waldo neighborhood of Kansas City. For the past several years, I have made my living as the Contracts and Compliance Manager for Redstone Transit Systems. My professional life consists of reviewing massive stacks of legal documents, hunting down discrepancies, ensuring regulatory standards are met, and preventing systems from collapsing due to unseen errors. I am the person who fixes things before anyone else even realizes they are broken. I am the safety net. That is my job at the office, and until this particular morning, that was my exact role within my own family. I was the stable daughter, the nice one, the one who never caused a scene and never made anyone uncomfortable. As I drove my sedan across the state line into Prairie Village, Kansas on Christmas morning, the heater fighting against the bitter Midwest frost, I had no intention of being anything else. My parents' house sat at the end of a long, meticulously shoveled driveway, looking exactly the way a wealthy suburban home is supposed to look on the 25th of December. Stepping through the heavy oak front door was like walking onto a soundstage built specifically to sell the concept of the perfect American holiday. The air inside was thick and warm, heavily scented with expensive cinnamon candles and the smell of roasting meats. A curated playlist, featuring the smooth velvety voice of Nat King Cole, played softly from hidden speakers, ensuring there was never an awkward silence. The brick fireplace in the living room burned with a bright, steady red glow. In the adjacent dining room, the table was already set by my mother, Laurel Davis. It was a masterpiece of domestic engineering featuring polished silverware, crystal glasses, and linen napkins folded with geometric precision. It looked like a photograph from a high-end lifestyle magazine, waiting only for the perfect family to take their seats. The house was full of the people who mattered. My father, Randall Davis, stood near the kitchen island, wearing a tailored cashmere sweater, holding a mug of dark roast coffee, and looking effortlessly authoritative. My younger sister Piper, the undisputed center of gravity in our family, was lounging on the oversized velvet sofa. Piper is the kind of daughter parents boast about at country club dinners. She is beautiful, loud, endlessly dramatic, and constantly launching new creative ventures that require everyone else to act as her audience and support staff. Her husband Nate sat beside her, smiling warmly and playing his part perfectly. A few close family friends drifted around the margins of the room, adding to the festive noise. I took off my coat, hung it in the hall closet, and quietly slipped into the living room, taking my usual spot in an armchair near the edge of the gathering. I was present but carefully out of the way, ready to fetch ice or refill drinks whenever the moment required. The tradition of opening presents in our family was essentially a theatrical performance starring Piper. I watched quietly as she tore the metallic wrapping paper off large boxes, letting out perfectly calibrated gasps of joy. Nate handed her a small, elegant box, and the entire room paused to watch her lift a heavy diamond necklace from its velvet bed. Laurel clapped her hands together in delight while Randall smiled with deep paternal satisfaction. I smiled as well because smiling and applauding my sister was simply part of the unspoken social contract of being Emery Davis. As the pile of gifts under the towering spruce tree began to dwindle, Randall turned his attention toward me. He picked up a square box wrapped tightly in heavy silver paper and tied with a thick blue ribbon. He walked across the plush carpet and handed the box to me. He did not look into my eyes. His gaze was already drifting back toward the kitchen where Laurel was arranging appetizers. He casually stated that he thought this would suit me. His voice was completely flat, carrying the tone of a man executing a minor administrative task. I accepted the box, noting its solid, familiar weight. A sudden foolish wave of genuine warmth rose in my chest. For one brief, terrible second, I thought that my father had finally paid attention to me, that he had sought out something meaningful just for me. I pulled the blue ribbon, watching it fall away, and carefully tore the silver paper. I lifted the lid of the sturdy cardboard box. The air seemed to leave the room. The ambient noise of the gathering, the music, the crackle of the fire, the laughter suddenly sounded as though it was happening underwater. Resting inside the box, nestled securely on a bed of white tissue paper, was a vintage Canon AE1 camera. It was not just any camera. It was a meticulously restored piece of equipment. The silver metal body gleamed perfectly. The black leather grip was entirely unblemished. Attached to the metal side lugs was a custom-crafted dark brown leather strap. Stamped into the thick leather in crisp, deliberate letters was an inscription that read, "RD, keep looking." It was the exact gift I had given my father exactly 1 year ago. My mind began to race desperately, trying to build a bridge of logic over a chasm of heartbreak. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, a mistake, a mix-up with the wrapping. But there is no mistaking a custom inscription. I remembered the weeks I had spent scouring vintage camera shops across 3 states, because he had once fleetingly mentioned shooting film in his 20s. I remembered the hundreds of dollars I had spent having the internal mechanics cleaned and the light meter recalibrated. I remembered the quiet hope I felt when I ordered that specific leather strap. My hands went completely numb. I reached into the box, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the camera body. I slipped my hand into the small side pocket of the canvas bag tucked beneath the lens. I pulled out a small square envelope made of heavy cardstock. I opened the flap. Inside was the handwritten card I had penned last December. My own neat handwriting stared back at me, expressing my love and hoping this camera would bring him joy in his upcoming retirement. He had never used it. He had never even opened the bag. He had received my gift, smiled his polite smile, and then shoved the box deep into a closet. It had sat in the dark for 12 months until he needed something heavy and suitably sized to hand back to his eldest daughter on Christmas morning, so he could check my name off his list. He had not even bothered to look inside to see what he was regifting. Across the room, Piper threw her head back and let out a bright musical laugh at something Nate had just whispered. Laurel was moving through the room, offering warm pastries on a silver tray. Randall was checking his phone, his thumb scrolling casually. Not a single person in that room was looking at me. Not one of them noticed that the quiet, stable, reliable daughter sitting in the corner had just been completely erased. They did not see the color drain from my face. They did not notice the way my hands trembled as I carefully placed the lid back onto the silver box. I slowly stood up, clutching the box against my side. I did not scream. I did not throw the heavy vintage camera into the roaring fireplace. I did not demand an explanation or an apology from the man who had just handed me my own discarded love. I simply turned and walked toward the hallway. I announced to the empty space in front of me that I needed to step outside to take a work call. No one asked who was calling on Christmas morning. No one even turned their head. I retrieved my coat from the closet and walked out the front door into the biting December wind. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, instantly severing the sounds of the perfect family gathering. I walked down the driveway, unlocked my sedan, and placed the silver box gently on the passenger seat. I started the engine, backed out of the driveway, and drove away from Prairie Village. The drive back to Waldo took 45 minutes. The sky overhead was a flat, unyielding gray, and the bare branches of the trees looked like jagged cracks in the atmosphere. I did not shed a single tear. Crying implies a sense of loss, and what I felt was not loss. It was an absolute freezing clarity. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the heater blasting warm air against my face, while my chest felt entirely hollow. 2 hours later, I was sitting on my sofa in the silent stillness of my own living room, staring at a blank television screen. The silver box sat on the coffee table in front of me. My phone buzzed against the wood. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message from Laurel. A tiny, pathetic part of me, the part that had spent 3 decades trying to earn their love, hoped she was asking if I was safe. I hoped she had noticed my sudden absence and was reaching out in panic. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It read, "Are you still bringing the candlesticks tomorrow?" There was no question mark. There was no inquiry about my well-being. There was no acknowledgement of my departure. It was simply a logistical demand for the holiday brunch she was hosting the following day. I was not a daughter who had fled her childhood home in silent agony. I was an unpaid event coordinator who was responsible for the table decor. I slowly lowered the phone. I turned my gaze back to the physical box now resting on my coffee table. I reached over, took the camera out of the box, and let the custom leather strap run through my fingers. The camera sat there heavy and cold, an undeniable piece of physical evidence. It was the concrete proof of a truth I had spent 32 years trying to avoid. I had never truly been seen by the people who brought me into the world. I was a tool, a convenience, a shadow that kept their lives running smoothly. They did not love Emory Davis. They loved what Emory Davis could do for them. But as I sat there in the quiet of my house, looking at the regifted camera, the crushing weight of that realization began to harden into something else. It hardened into a spine. If I was completely invisible to them, then I was also completely free. They had no idea what happened when a shadow decided to stop moving. I put the camera back into its box. I did not reply to my mother's message. For the first time in my entire life, the reliable daughter was officially off the clock. Growing up in the Davis household was like living inside a snow globe that someone else was constantly shaking for their own amusement. From the outside looking in, we appeared to be the absolute pinnacle of American suburban stability. We never wanted for anything. There were summer vacations to coastal towns, perfectly coordinated holiday outfits, and a neatly manicured lawn that signaled to the entire neighborhood that everything under our roof was secure and thriving. But the internal mechanics of a family are rarely as simple or as flawless as the image they project to the street. In our house, all the available light naturally gravitated toward my younger sister, leaving the rest of us to operate in the shadows she cast. Piper was the kind of daughter parents collected like a rare prize and displayed at every possible social opportunity. She was effortlessly radiant, constantly talking, and possessed an innate, terrifying ability to make anyone she spoke to feel like they were the most fascinating person in the room. She always had an interesting new project, a budding business venture, or a dramatic life update ready to be served over dinner. Whether she was launching a lifestyle blog, organizing a charity gala, or redecorating her home, she provided the endless entertainment, and my parents eagerly bought front-row tickets to her life every single time. I, on the other hand, was the unseen foundation holding the entire stage together. If Piper was the leading lady, I was the stagehand dressing in dark colors, so the audience would not notice my presence. My role in the family was entirely functional and devoid of glamour. I was the one who memorized the router password and spent hours resetting the wireless internet when it inevitably dropped during my father's important video calls. I was the person who sorted through the confusing medical insurance forms, ensuring my mother submitted her claims before the 90-day deadlines expired. I was the reliable keeper of the spare house keys, the designated driver for airport pickups at 4 a.m, and the one who always remembered to write and mail the thank you cards after every single family event. If a restaurant reservation needed to be secured for a busy Friday night for 14 people, the task naturally fell to me. I managed the quiet, invisible labor that kept our lives operating smoothly while asking for absolutely nothing in return. Very early on, my parents assigned me a specific convenient label. They called me the strong one. It is a phrase that sounds like a compliment, but in the context of a family dynamic like mine, it is actually a deeply insidious curse. Being declared the strong daughter is simply a polite, socially acceptable way for parents to say that this particular child can endure neglect. It means they do not have to worry about you because you will handle your own problems, your own heartbreaks, and your own failures in total silence. It is a free pass and authorization for them to redirect all their emotional resources and financial support toward the child who demands them the loudest. I accepted the title of the strong one because I was young and foolish enough to think it made me valuable. I thought being constantly useful was a valid substitute for being genuinely loved. This desperate, pathetic need to be valued brings me back to the origin of the camera. I spent years quietly collecting scraps of attention from my father. Randall was a man whose affections were heavily guarded, locked away behind layers of professional detachment and suburban stoicism. but I vividly remembered a fleeting conversation we shared when I was in my early 20s. He had been cleaning out the attic one rainy Saturday and found an old light meter tucked inside a shoebox. For 20 uninterrupted minutes, he stood in the dusty light of the attic and actually talked to me. He spoke about his passion for film photography, the mechanical precision of loading 36 exposures into a camera back, and the specific chemical magic of developing black and white prints in a darkroom. He told me he always dreamed of returning to that hobby once he finally retired and had the time to truly see the world again. I locked that rare conversation away in my mind, treating it like a precious treasure map that might one day lead me directly to his heart. Last autumn, roughly 60 days before Christmas, I decided it was time to finally use that map. I spent weeks scouring the internet and driving to obscure vintage shops across 3 different state lines looking for the exact model he had described that day in the attic. I finally located a pristine Canon AE1. I paid exactly $350 for the camera body and another $275 for professional restoration. I had the internal mechanisms thoroughly cleaned, the degraded light seals meticulously replaced, and the shutter speed perfectly calibrated by an expert. I ordered a custom leather strap online, waiting another 14 days for it to arrive by mail. I spent 2 entire evenings writing and rewriting the card that would accompany the gift. I poured all my quiet, unacknowledged love onto that small square of heavy paper, telling him how much I admired him and how excited I was for him to rediscover his artistic passion now that he had the freedom to do so. I presented the heavy box to him last Christmas. I watched his hands pull away the wrapping paper with my own heart pounding wildly against my ribs. I waited for the recognition. I waited for the moment his eyes would meet mine and he would realize that I had truly listened to him. But right at the exact second the lid came off the box, Piper burst through the dining room doors, holding a bottle of expensive champagne and waving a stack of legal papers. She loudly announced that she and Nate had just secured the commercial lease for her new botanical skincare boutique. The shift in the room was instantaneous and violent. The gravitational pull of my sister ripped every eye, every smile, and every ounce of my parents' attention away from my father and his freshly opened box. Randall immediately dropped the camera onto the side table and rushed across the room to embrace Piper. Laurel began weeping loud theatrical tears of joy. Extended family members raised their glasses in a spontaneous, deafening toast. I stood there frozen, watching the custom leather strap slip out of the box and hang over the edge of the mahogany table, completely ignored. The moment I had spent 2 long months meticulously building was instantly swallowed whole by another one of Piper's grand unveilings. For the next 12 months, I fed myself a steady, pathetic diet of rationalizations. Every time I visited their house for Sunday dinners and did not see the camera sitting on his desk, I invented a new elaborate lie to protect my own fragile feelings. I told myself he was keeping it safe in its original packaging until the weather turned warmer in the spring. I convinced myself he considered it too valuable and delicate to use casually around the house. I imagined he was waiting for a special trip to the mountains, or a grand anniversary milestone to finally load the very first roll of film. I built a massive, heavy fortress of excuses around his utter indifference, because the alternative truth was simply too painful to face. I chose not to see what was right in front of me. This year on Christmas morning, when he casually handed that same silver-wrapped box back to me, that entire fortress completely collapsed into dust. The delusions evaporated. He had not been saving it for a special occasion. He had not treasured it. He had not even bothered to look inside the small canvas bag to find my handwritten card. He had simply shoved the gift into the dark, forgotten corners of his closet the moment the boutique announcement was over. He had forgotten the effort, the money, the handwritten words, and ultimately he had completely forgotten me. The return of the camera was not a mere accident of holiday gifting or an innocent senior moment. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of my entire existence within the Davis family structure. It proved beyond any reasonable doubt that my love, my time, and my careful, devoted observation of their lives were entirely expendable. The crushing realization that sat heavy in my chest was not simply about a piece of vintage photographic equipment being rejected. The true burning agony lay in understanding that my affection had always been placed at the very bottom of the priority list. I was never the beloved eldest daughter. I was the administrative assistant to their family narrative. The vintage camera was just the cold, heavy mirror that finally forced me to look at my own reflection and acknowledge the brutal, unvarnished truth. I had spent 32 years proving exactly how useful I could be, but being useful is not, and has never been the same thing as being chosen. The phone rang on the afternoon of the 4th of January. The caller identification displayed the name of my mother. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the glass screen. Laurel opened the conversation with a breezy observation about the unusually mild winter weather we were having. Her voice was light and airy, perfectly modulated to sound casual, like we were discussing a recipe or a television show. Then she smoothly pivoted to her actual objective. She told me I had been acting a little strange lately. She used the word strange as if I had suddenly decided to paint my living room walls black or wear my winter clothes backward. It was a word specifically chosen to place the burden of abnormality entirely on my shoulders. I did not offer my usual polite deflections. I took a slow breath and told her exactly what happened. I kept my voice completely steady as I explained the vintage camera. I explained the custom leather strap. I described the handwritten card still tucked securely in the canvas bag. I laid out the absolute undeniable fact that my father had wrapped up my own deeply personal gift from 12 months prior and handed it back to me like it was a generic corporate giveaway. There was a brief hollow silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of her television playing in the background. When my mother finally spoke, her first instinct was not horror. It was not empathy. It was immediate tactical damage control. She let out a breathy, nervous laugh and suggested that Piper must have mixed up the gift tags during the chaotic wrapping session. She said my father simply did not notice what was inside the box because he was distracted by the holiday rush. I asked her how a grown man fails to notice an engraved leather strap and a personalized letter from his own child. Laurel brushed past my question entirely, refusing to engage with the logic. She insisted it was just a silly oversight and told me not to be so incredibly sensitive over a simple mistake. Being called too sensitive was her absolute favorite weapon against any emotion that threatened the pleasant surface of her life. 2 hours later, my phone vibrated again. This time it was Piper. My sister did not bother with small talk or pleasantries. She immediately launched into a frustrated, rapid-fire monologue about my sudden departure on the holiday. She did not ask if I was hurt. She did not ask why I left so abruptly. She simply accused me of making everything awkward for her and Nate. She complained that my absence had ruined the aesthetic of the family photographs they took later that afternoon because there was an empty space by the fireplace. She went on to say that my dramatic exit had completely overshadowed the celebration of her new business lease. I listened to her voice rising in pitch, demanding an apology for the discomfort I had supposedly caused her on her special day. For 32 years, I would have apologized. I would have smoothed it over. But this time, I simply removed the phone from my ear and pressed the red button while she was mid-sentence. I did not care. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple, a single text message arrived from my father. It contained exactly 7 words. Dad did not mean anything by it. I stared at the glowing screen for 20 full minutes, watching the battery percentage drop from 82 to 80. That single sentence was infinitely worse than a clumsy apology. It was a complete dismissal of reality. It reduced my heartbreak to an administrative error that required no further discussion. He could not even type the word I. He referred to himself in the third person, creating a cowardly grammatical distance between his actions and my pain. He was absolving himself of any intent which in his mind completely erased the impact. If he did not mean to hurt me, then according to his logic, I was not allowed to be hurt. The following morning, I received an official summons masked as a casual invitation. Laurel asked me to come over for Sunday dinner so we could all just sit down and talk like adults. I knew exactly what that phrase meant in our family vocabulary. It was an intervention designed to force me to swallow my grievance, so the surface of their lives could remain smooth and undisturbed. Talking like adults meant I was expected to accept their flimsy excuses and pretend nothing was fundamentally broken. I arrived at their house at exactly 6 in the evening on Sunday. The dining room table was set with the everyday floral china, but the atmosphere was thick and suffocating. The air felt incredibly heavy pressing down on my chest the moment I walked through the door. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic potatoes, usually so comforting, now turned my stomach. Randall sat at the head of the table, meticulously cutting his meat, focusing intensely on his plate. Laurel hovered near the serving dishes, offering forced, overly bright smiles, and commenting excessively on the tenderness of the chicken. Piper sat across from me, endlessly scrolling through her social media feeds, with her thumb completely detached from the tension radiating off the walls. We ate in agonizing silence for 15 brutal minutes. The only sounds were the scraping of silver forks against porcelain plates, the clinking of ice in water glasses, and the faint rhythmic hum of the kitchen refrigerator. Finally, Laurel cleared her throat, folded her napkin, and smiled at me. She adopted the soothing, patronizing tone usually reserved for placating a tired toddler. She said we should clear the air and move past this tiny little misunderstanding so we could get back to being a happy family. I placed my fork down on the table. I looked directly at my father. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a tear. I asked him a very simple, direct question. I asked him if he remembered why I chose that specific vintage camera for him in the first place. Randall stopped cutting his meat. The silver knife clattered slightly against the edge of the plate. His jaw tightened visibly. He looked at Laurel for a fraction of a second, seeking an escape route or an assist before finally looking at me. His eyes were cold, defensive, and heavily guarded. He shifted uncomfortably in his heavy wooden chair. He cleared his throat and aggressively adjusted his collar as if the room had suddenly grown too hot. I asked him again. I asked if he remembered the rainy Saturday afternoon in the attic when I was 22 years old. I asked if he remembered standing in the dust telling me about his dream of returning to the darkroom once he retired. I asked if he remembered me. He let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. He threw his linen napkin onto the table with unnecessary force. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the wood, and pointed a thick finger in my direction. He told me to stop it. He told me to grow up. He told me not to turn a simple, honest misunderstanding into a stage. The temperature in my blood plummeted to absolute zero, a stage. That was the specific word he chose to hurl at me. My silent, agonizing heartbreak over being entirely erased from his memory was nothing more than a theatrical performance to him. In his eyes, I was not a wounded daughter bleeding out at his dinner table. I was merely a nuisance creating unnecessary drama that interrupted his quiet, peaceful evening. My pain was a massive inconvenience to his comfort. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to object. Piper did not even lift her head from her glowing screen, her thumb continuing its endless upward swipe. Laurel was already leaning forward, waving her hands frantically, and offering a fresh platter of roasted vegetables, desperate to smother the conflict under a thick, suffocating blanket of domestic hospitality. She told my father to calm down and told me to just let it go for the sake of peace. No one in that room was willing to name the truth. No one was willing to look at the ugly, decaying reality of how they treated me and acknowledge it out loud. I did not argue with them. I did not cry. I did not try to explain the immense, crushing depth of my devastation. Explaining requires a willing, attentive audience, and I finally understood with absolute terrifying clarity that I was speaking to a completely empty theater. They lacked the capacity to hear me. I stood up from the heavy wooden chair, pushing it back so it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I picked up my wool coat from the back of the chair. Laurel immediately panicked, her voice rising an octave as she asked where I was going and reminded me that the cherry pie was already warming in the oven. I did not answer her. I turned my back on the table, walked out of the dining room across the polished foyer and out the heavy front door. The cold January night air hit my face like a physical blow biting into my skin, but it felt incredibly beautifully clean. As I started my car and pulled away from the meticulously manicured curb, the final stubborn remnants of my childhood illusions shattered completely. I watched their perfectly lit house shrink in the rearview mirror. I made a silent, unbreakable vow in the dark enclosed space of my vehicle. I decided right then and there, I would never again beg them to see me. I would never again exhaust myself trying to translate my worth into a language they actively refused to speak. For the very first time in my existence, I would stop explaining myself in order to be loved. The endlessly accommodating invisible daughter was completely irrevocably dead. I did not draft a dramatic manifesto. I did not post a passive-aggressive quote on my social media feeds. I did not send a long emotionally charged email to my parents detailing my grievances and outlining my personal boundaries. I simply stopped. If the infrastructure of my family was a massive humming machine, I did not take a sledgehammer to the engine block. I merely walked over to the wall and quietly pulled the plug from the socket. The most destructive thing a foundational pillar can do is simply walk away and let gravity handle the rest. I realized that grand announcements only invite arguments, and I was entirely done arguing for my right to exist in their minds. For over a decade, I had functioned as the unpaid invisible administrator of the Davis household. I maintained the master spreadsheet containing every single streaming service banking portal and utility password. I managed the digital calendar that sent automated alerts for upcoming property tax deadlines and biannual dental cleanings. I was the silent ghostwriter who drafted the annual charity donation appeals and the graphic designer who threw together elegant digital invitations for their endless array of cocktail hours and holiday brunches. I even purchased, wrapped, and shipped the birthday gifts that my mother supposedly sent to our distant relatives, carefully signing her name in a script that perfectly mimicked her own. On the second Monday of January, I deleted the family calendar from my phone. I removed my credit card from the shared travel accounts. I dragged the massive digital folder containing their event templates and donation files directly into the trash bin on my desktop and clicked empty. I watched the little digital paper crumble into nothingness and felt a profound physical lightness spread through my shoulders. Our family group chat instantly lost its designated organizer, but predictably, absolutely no one noticed at first. They had spent so many years riding the smooth rails of my silent labor that they genuinely believed the train propelled itself. January slipped into February, and the digital space remained devoid of my usual cheerful reminders to confirm headcount for upcoming weekend dinners or links to restaurant menus. The only messages that populated the screen were random links Piper found amusing, or Laurel sending unprompted updates about her garden. They lived in a magical reality where dinner reservations simply materialized and utility bills paid themselves. When they finally did reach out individually, it was never to check on my emotional state. Their communication was strictly transactional, revealing the exact nature of my value to them. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, Laurel sent a text message complaining that she was locked out of her luxury travel portal and demanded the recovery code. She did not ask how my week was going. 3 days later, Piper called me while she was driving, speaking over the sound of highway traffic, demanding that I immediately locate and forward the digital sponsor packet for her upcoming spring gala because she had accidentally deleted her copy. She spoke with the hurried impatience of a manager directing a subordinate. The following week, Nate sent a casual email asking if I could dig up an old vendor contract template I had drafted for his firm 2 years prior. Every single interaction was a blunt request for service. I was a human search engine, a free administrative assistant waiting in the wings. Through all of this, my father remained completely, utterly silent. Randall did not text. He did not call. He did not email. It was as if I had not physically vanished from his life, but had merely faded into the background wallpaper of his existence. He was entirely comfortable with my absence as long as it did not directly disrupt his daily routine or his personal comfort. His absolute silence was the loudest confirmation of everything I had realized on that frozen holiday morning. He simply did not care enough to notice the empty space I left behind. I did not ignore them immediately. The first few times they reached out with their demands, I responded with a tone of polite corporate detachment. I told Laurel I no longer had access to the travel portal passwords and gently suggested she contact customer service to verify her identity. I informed Piper that I had cleared out my old hard drives at the end of the year and no longer possessed the sponsor files. I emailed Nate a brief sentence stating I could not locate the contract on my current system. I offered no apologies for the inconvenience. I provided no alternative solutions. I simply closed the door quietly but firmly. After the third week of February, I stopped replying altogether. When Piper sent a frantic late-night text begging me to urgently fix a broken hyperlink on her boutique website, I let the message sit unread. I did not rush to my computer to execute a midnight rescue mission. I poured myself a glass of cold water, turned off the bedside lamp, pulled the heavy quilt up to my chin, and went to sleep. The silence that eventually settled over my life in the aftermath of my withdrawal was heavy. It genuinely hurt. There is a profound, isolating grief in realizing that the people who share your blood and your history only miss your presence when they need something fixed or organized. But for the very first time in my existence, the pain I felt was incredibly clean. It was no longer muddied by my own desperate mental gymnastics and rationalizations. I was no longer twisting myself into psychological knots, trying to justify their constant neglect. The toxic lie I had fed myself for over 30 years, the pathetic, comforting myth that I was just loved in a different, quieter way than my sister was finally dead and buried. I was never loved differently. I was merely used conveniently. Stripping away that lifelong delusion felt like ripping a thick bandage off a deep infected wound, but the fresh air hitting the raw skin was ultimately exactly what I needed to begin to heal. The agonizing confusion was gone, replaced by a stark, illuminating clarity. In that sterile, quiet space, my chronic, lifelong sadness began to calcify. The deep well of sorrow that had defined my entire adulthood began to freeze solid, turning into a rigid, unbreakable spine. I stopped slouching under the crushing weight of their unspoken expectations. My physical posture literally changed. I walked through my quiet suburban house with a new deliberate rhythm. This withdrawal was not a temporary temper tantrum. It was not an impulsive emotional outburst designed to solicit a dramatic apology from my parents. It was the calculated, quiet beginning of a highly refined retribution. I realized I did not need to actively sabotage them. I did not need to plant bombs in their perfect lives or scream from the rooftops about their profound selfishness. Their entire reality, the flawless image they projected to the world, was built on a fragile, hidden scaffolding constructed entirely of my invisible labor. All I had to do was stand back, lower my hands, and let the natural consequences of my absence take hold. I was going to let the bills come due. I was going to let the crucial deadlines pass, the important passwords expire, and the meticulously curated image of the Davis family slowly, inevitably crack under its own unmanaged weight. My revenge was not going to be loud or violent. It was simply stepping completely out of the way and letting the absolute truth arrive to collect its long overdue payment. For my entire adult life, my Saturday mornings were entirely spoken for. They were rigidly scheduled blocks of time dedicated to executing whatever tasks my mother required for her endless stream of social engagements. I would spend my weekends picking up specialty linens, tracking down misplaced catering invoices, or arranging folding chairs in precise symmetrical rows. I was the reliable ghost haunting the background of her parties. But when the first weekend of spring arrived, I did not drive to Prairie Village. I did not send a text message asking if anyone needed me to pick up extra ice. Instead, I drove my car down into the industrial heart of Kansas City and parked in front of a sprawling brick building known as the Crossfield Arts Warehouse. I had quietly enrolled in an 8-week beginner course in darkroom photography. Walking into that space felt like stepping onto an entirely different planet. The air inside the warehouse was heavy with the sharp acidic scent of developer fluid and stop bath. The concrete floors were stained, and the massive industrial windows let in broad columns of pale morning light. My instructor was a woman named Colette Mercer. She was a retired photojournalist who had spent 4 decades documenting global conflicts and political campaigns before settling down to teach. Colette was deeply unpretentious. She possessed rough, calloused hands, a shock of untamed gray hair, and a pair of dark eyes that seemed to cut straight through any social pleasantries. She did not care about suburban etiquette. She only cared about the truth captured on film. During our third session, we were standing side by side under the dim red glow of the safe light, watching my latest contact sheet slowly materialize in the chemical bath. Colette leaned over the plastic tray, squinting at the tiny black and white squares. She remained silent for several long minutes before pulling the sheet out with a pair of metal tongs. She turned to me and delivered an observation that completely dismantled my remaining emotional armor. She told me that I had a good eye, but I was shooting my subjects like I was constantly apologizing for being there. She said I composed every single image as if I was silently asking for permission to exist within the frame. She told me to stop standing so far back and to stop hiding behind the lens. Her words rang in my ears long after I left the warehouse. They were a perfect, brutal diagnosis of my entire personality. I realized I had spent my life hovering at the edges, trying not to intrude, trying not to take up too much space. The very next morning, I woke up at 4 o'clock. I dressed in warm layers, grabbed the heavy vintage camera, and drove downtown. I did not look for beautiful, sweeping landscapes or perfectly posed subjects. I started walking through the forgotten, overlooked corners of the city. I found a diner on Troost Avenue glowing with harsh fluorescent light at 5 in the morning and photographed the solitary waitress wiping down the long laminate counter. I walked through the West Bottoms, capturing the peeling paint on abandoned warehouses, the rust creeping up the sides of old train cars, and the empty, sprawling concrete parking lots that nobody bothered to look at twice. I was drawn to the structures that simply did their jobs while remaining completely invisible to the people rushing past them. Through my time at the warehouse, I slowly began to build something I had never truly experienced before. I built a community. I formed a fast, effortless friendship with Theo Bennett, a man who ran a custom framing studio in the basement of the building. Theo always smelled faintly of cut pine and varnish. He had a quiet, steady presence and a deep appreciation for the mechanics of visual art. I also grew close to Willa Rhodes, a local archivist and librarian who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of discontinued film stocks. After our Saturday classes, the three of us would often sit on the concrete loading docks behind the warehouse, drinking cheap black coffee from paper cups and talking for hours. For the first time in my 32 years, I found myself sitting with people who would ask me a direct question and then actually wait in complete silence to hear my answer. They did not interrupt me to talk about their own business ventures. They did not glance at their phones while I was speaking. Theo would ask my opinion on a matte finish, and Willa would ask how I felt about a certain lighting technique. They looked at me when I spoke. They absorbed my words. It was a profoundly disorienting experience to realize that my thoughts possessed actual value to other human beings. This newfound sense of grounding began to bleed into my professional life at Redstone Transit Systems. I was no longer just the quiet compliance manager pushing papers across a desk. I was feeling sharper and more acutely aware of my own competence. In late March, I was tasked with auditing a massive vendor file for a multi-million-dollar infrastructure expansion project. As I cross-referenced the labor hours against the material receipts, my eyes caught a subtle repeating anomaly. One of our primary concrete contractors was systematically padding their invoices. They were using obscured billing codes to charge us an extra 12% on secondary materials across dozens of separate work orders. The discrepancy was buried deep beneath hundreds of pages of technical jargon deliberately designed to exhaust anyone who tried to read it. In the past, I might have simply highlighted the error and passed it quietly up the chain of command, hoping someone else would handle the confrontation. This time, I spent 6 uninterrupted hours building a flawless, airtight spreadsheet documenting every single fraudulent charge. I drafted a concise direct report and marched straight into the office of the division director, Marlo Kent. Marlo was a formidable woman who did not tolerate incompetence and rarely handed out compliments. She reviewed my file in complete silence, her eyes scanning the columns of hard data. When she finally looked up, she did not offer empty corporate flattery. She closed the folder, leaned back in her leather chair, and looked me dead in the eye. She told me that I was the only person keeping the entire operational system from collapsing under the weight of external greed and internal laziness. She explicitly ordered me to never let anyone inside or outside the building make my meticulous nature seem small or insignificant. Hearing those words from a woman of her caliber felt like receiving an emotional blood transfusion. Marlo saw the exact same traits my family had exploited for decades: But instead of using them to diminish me, she recognized them as an absolute position of power. Later that week, I found myself back in the darkroom, standing alone under the familiar red light. I slid a piece of photographic paper into the developer tray and gently rocked the plastic tub back and forth. I watched as the image slowly bloomed to life. It was a photograph I had taken beneath a massive highway overpass. The composition focused entirely on the heavy, scarred concrete pillars anchoring the road above, bearing the immense crushing weight of thousands of daily commuters. The pillars were ugly weather-beaten and completely ignored by the people driving over them, but without them, the entire structure would instantly fall apart. I used a set of wooden tongs to lift the dripping print from the tray and hung it on the wire line to dry. I stared at the stark, contrasting lines of black and white. I decided right then to title the piece "Held Together by the Unseen." It was not just a title for a photograph of a bridge, it was the absolute summary of my entire life up to this exact point. The heavy vintage camera that my father had so carelessly tossed back to me was no longer a symbol of my rejection. The cold metal body and the custom leather strap had completely transformed in my hands. It was now the very tool I was using to reclaim my own narrative. The fundamental shift inside my chest was finally complete. I was no longer the desperate daughter trying to arrange the perfect lighting so my family might finally turn their heads and look at me. I was the one looking through the viewfinder. I was deciding what mattered. I was deciding what belonged in the frame. I was finally learning how to see myself first. The second week of April arrived with a heavy, steady rain that washed the last of the winter grime from the streets of Kansas City. It also brought a certified letter to my front door. The postal worker stood on my porch, holding an electronic clipboard, demanding a physical signature before he would hand over the thick manila envelope. I signed my name, tracing the letters with my finger on the screen, and took the package inside. The return address, printed in stark black ink in the upper left corner, belonged to the Kansas Charity Oversight Division. A cold spike of pure corporate adrenaline hit my bloodstream the moment I read those words. In my line of work, a certified letter from a state oversight board is never a friendly inquiry. I tore open the flap and pulled out a stack of densely typed legal documents. The letter was formally addressed to me, listing my official title as the acting treasurer of the Davis Promise Foundation. The foundation was a philanthropic entity my mother had dreamed up roughly 5 years ago. On paper, it was designed to provide community scholarships and fund local arts initiatives. In reality, it was a highly engineered vanity project. Laurel used the foundation to secure prime seating at elite society events, while Piper plastered her own face across every single promotional brochure, positioning herself as a selfless young philanthropist. When they first launched the idea, I was the one who sat at my dining table late into the night filing the complex 501c3 tax paperwork, drafting the corporate bylaws, and setting up the initial banking structures. Once the tedious foundational work was complete, I handed them the operational binders and walked away. I had not looked at a single financial ledger or attended a board meeting in over 48 months. According to the documents trembling in my hands, the state of Kansas believed otherwise. I immediately walked to my home office, booted up my laptop, and navigated to the state government donor portal. I dug through my password manager and used an old archived administrative credential to log into the foundation backend. The dashboard loaded, and the breath completely left my lungs. My name was everywhere. I was listed as the primary financial contact on the annual state filings. I was listed as the authorized signatory on the vendor contracts for the upcoming summer gala. Worst of all, my name was attached to dozens of recent expenditure authorizations spanning the last 3 fiscal quarters. My professional instincts took over, overriding my rising panic. I downloaded the raw transaction logs and began doing exactly what Redstone Transit Systems paid me to do every day. I audited the file. It took me less than 40 minutes to find the rot. The foundation accounts were bleeding money into places that had absolutely nothing to do with community outreach. I found a disbursement of $4,500 paid to a boutique public relations firm for what was vaguely labeled as brand alignment. A quick search revealed that the firm exclusively managed Piper's personal social media presence. I found a recurring monthly charge of $800 for high-end floral arrangements, delivered directly to my parents' private residence coded as event staging. There were $1,000 receipts for luxury salon treatments, VIP concert tickets, and private catering, all neatly buried under vague categories like community engagement and donor relations. They were treating a tax-exempt charity fund like a personal checking account. The true nausea hit me when I opened a specific amended tax filing submitted back in February. At the bottom of the digital document was an electronic signature authorization block. It certified under penalty of perjury that the financial disclosures were accurate and verified. The signature attached to that document was mine. Someone had typed my full legal name and checked the authorization box from an internet protocol address that I easily traced back to the primary wireless router in Prairie Village. They had not just mismanaged funds, they had actively forged my digital signature to shield themselves from legal liability. My phone vibrated on the desk, jolting me out of my intense focus. It was Piper. I answered the call and put her on speakerphone, letting her voice fill the quiet office. She sounded completely unbothered, floating on her usual cloud of self-importance. She adopted a tone that was half pleading and half profoundly annoyed. She casually mentioned that the state had sent some confusing letters to the house and asked if I could just log in and clean up a little bit of messy paperwork. She framed it as a minor inconvenience, a small administrative favor I needed to rush through before our parents' massive upcoming anniversary celebration. She actually sighed into the receiver and complained that dealing with government forms was completely draining her creative energy. I did not yell. I kept my voice as flat and clinical as a courtroom transcript. I told my sister that she had expensed her personal branding consultants to a tax-exempt charity. I told her I was staring at a forged electronic signature that constituted state fraud. The line went completely silent for 5 seconds, before Piper let out a sharp defensive scoff. She immediately accused me of overreacting and acting like a rigid corporate drone. She claimed those expenses were absolutely necessary for maintaining the public face of the charity. Before she could launch into another delusional monologue, I ended the call. Less than 10 minutes later, Laurel called. Piper had clearly sounded the alarm. My mother deployed her softest, most patronizing voice. She cooed into the phone, telling me that I was getting entirely too worked up over a simple administrative error. She insisted that they always meant to reimburse the fund, but things just got so busy with the spring season. When I refused to back down, Randall suddenly took the phone from her hand. His voice was thick with masculine authority and deep annoyance. He told me to stop playing the auditor with my own blood. He said families help each other out, and that using my name on the paperwork was just a convenient way to keep things moving smoothly while I was busy with my own life. He ordered me to fix the files quietly and stop trying to create a legal crisis out of nothing. I ended the connection and placed the phone face down on the desk. They honestly believed they had done nothing wrong. They genuinely did not view using my identity to mask their financial negligence as a severe betrayal. In their minds, my reputation, my professional credentials, and my legal standing were communal property. They felt entirely entitled to use my clean record to absorb their dirty mistakes. I sat in the quiet glow of my computer monitor, listening to the rain hit the glass of my office window. The profound sadness that had anchored me since Christmas morning completely evaporated. The vintage camera left on the passenger seat of my car had merely been the first visible slap across the face. It had shown me their emotional neglect, but this digital ledger staring back at me illuminated something far more insidious. This was an entire mechanical system built to exploit my competence and harvest my integrity. They had assumed that because I was the quiet one, the accommodating one, the one who always absorbed the damage in silence, I would simply bow my head and quietly falsify government documents to protect their precious social standing. They thought I would risk my own career and my own freedom to ensure Piper could keep playing the generous socialite and Laurel could keep hosting her elegant parties. They had severely miscalculated. My professional life was built on holding corrupt systems accountable. I knew exactly how to dismantle a fraudulent structure from the inside out. This was no longer a story about a wounded daughter walking away from a cold family. The personal pain had officially mutated into a precise, calculated legal reckoning. The morning after discovering the forged signature, I walked into the downtown office of a corporate attorney. The legal department at Redstone Transit Systems had quietly provided his contact information after I asked a series of highly specific hypothetical questions about personal liability and nonprofit management. The attorney was a pragmatic man who spoke in precise, measured sentences and wore a suit that blended perfectly into the gray walls of his office. He reviewed the printouts of the state filings, the forged electronic signature, and the fraudulent expense reports I had compiled. He did not offer any emotional sympathy because the law does not care about suburban family dynamics or broken hearts. He simply laid out my immediate legal reality with chilling clarity. He told me I had the absolute right to formally withdraw my name from the foundation immediately. He explicitly instructed me to refuse any requests for retroactive authorizations to document every single discrepancy I had found and to secure a comprehensive paper trail. His advice was clinical and necessary. He told me to build a fortress of evidence to protect myself when the inevitable state audit occurred, because the government would look at the treasurer of record first. Armed with his legal directives, I spent the entire weekend conducting a forensic excavation of my own digital history. I sat in my home office surrounded by glowing screens, pulling up archived email servers, backup hard drives, and cloud storage accounts spanning the last 5 years. I was originally looking for financial irregularities, but what I uncovered was an extensive systematic theft of my own identity and voice. It was not just government forms they had stolen. They had plagiarized my actual effort, my intellect, and my soul. I found the original drafts of the heartfelt donor appreciation speeches I had spent weeks writing late into the night. I cross-referenced them with old video clips of Piper standing at a podium bathed in applause, delivering my exact words with a practiced tear in her eye, accepting the praise for her profound eloquence. I uncovered the complex operational pitch decks I had built at 3 a.m. to secure corporate sponsorships. In a forwarded email chain, Laurel casually presented my exhaustive research to the board of directors as a little passion project she and Piper had thrown together over morning coffee. The emotional toll of this digital autopsy was exhausting, but the final validating blow came from an entirely unexpected source. On Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother's older sister calling to ask for a recipe I had supposedly promised her months ago. Jean was a woman who lacked any internal filter and often spoke her mind without considering the collateral damage she left behind. When I politely mentioned that I was taking a step back from family obligations to focus on my demanding career, she let out a dry, knowing chuckle. She did not express any surprise at my absence. Instead, she casually dropped a sentence that hit me with the force of a physical strike. She told me I should not feel guilty because my mother always said I was the safest one to disappoint. The safest one to disappoint. The words echoed in the quiet space of my living room long after I ended the call. It was the exact unspoken thesis of my entire childhood, perfectly articulated by a woman looking for a casserole recipe. It confirmed every single suspicion I had ever harbored about my place in the family hierarchy. They did not ignore me by accident. They calculated the risk of my reaction and determined it was absolutely zero. They knew I would swallow the slight, absorb the neglect, and keep functioning without a word of complaint. My reliability was a weapon they used against me every single day. But the absolute bottom of this betrayal had not yet been reached. On Thursday evening, while verifying a chain of old emails related to the foundation tax status, I clicked on an attachment that had been misfiled in a folder marked for general correspondence. It was a scanned document from a wealth management firm dated 8 years ago. It was a comprehensive ledger detailing the disbursement of my late grandmother's educational trust. When she passed away, she had explicitly left a substantial sum of money divided equally between her 2 granddaughters, specifically designated for professional development and higher education. I had always believed that money vanished during an economic downturn. I stared at the scanned bank statements, my vision blurring at the edges as the numbers painted a horrifying picture. 8 years ago, Piper had impulsively signed a massive commercial lease for a luxury clothing boutique that predictably failed within its first 6 months. The resulting financial penalty to break the lease was catastrophic. According to the ledger on my screen, my parents had authorized the complete liquidation of my grandmother's trust to cover the staggering debt of my sister. They drained the entire account, including my half. The memory of what happened next rushed back with sickening clarity. A year after they drained the account, I needed capital to complete my advanced compliance management certification. I asked my parents for access to my portion of the inheritance. Laurel had looked me dead in the eye, sighed heavily, and placed her hand over mine. She had spun a tragic, elaborate story about how the stock market had severely impacted the family fund, and there was simply nothing left. I had walked into a local bank the very next day and taken out an expensive personal loan with an 8% interest rate to pay for my own education. I spent 3 years paying off that debt working overtime, while Piper continued to live in her subsidized reality. The discovery of that ledger fundamentally altered the chemistry of my grief. The deep, lingering sadness that had anchored me since the holiday morning was instantly incinerated. It was replaced by something infinitely sharper and far more dangerous. They had not just forgotten me emotionally. They had actively traded my financial security and my professional future to subsidize the catastrophic whims of my sister. They had lied to my face, watched me sign predatory loan documents, and then patted themselves on the back for keeping the flawless family image intact. They viewed my future as a totally expendable resource. A normal person might have driven straight to the house in Prairie Village, kicked in the heavy oak front door, and screamed until their throat bled. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I experienced a sensation of total, absolute lucidity. The emotional fog that had clouded my judgment for over 3 decades evaporated completely, leaving nothing but cold, hard facts. I saw the entire architecture of their exploitation mapped out in perfect detail. I was no longer a wounded victim reacting to their cruelty. I was a professional auditor examining a hopelessly corrupt system, and the only logical next step was a controlled demolition. I took the printed ledger, the forged signature documents, and the copied speeches to the darkroom that Saturday. I did not want to develop any film. I just needed to stand in the quiet red glow of the warehouse, surrounded by the sharp smell of chemicals. Colette was there, wiping down the metal developing trays. I did not give her the granular details of the stolen money or the specific legal fraud, but I told her enough. I told her the bottom of the well was much deeper and much uglier than I had ever imagined. Colette stopped wiping the tray. She leaned against the heavy concrete sink, crossed her arms over her chest, and looked at me with those piercing, seasoned eyes. She spoke in a low, steady voice that anchored me to the concrete floor. She told me I needed to listen to her very carefully. She said the biggest mistake people make when they are deeply wronged is that they confuse revenge with noise. They think justice is screaming and throwing things and demanding apologies from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving them. She reached out and tapped the manila folder holding my carefully gathered evidence. She told me the cleanest cut does not require any shouting. The cleanest cut is simply the unvarnished truth told in the exact right place exactly one time. Her words locked perfectly into the cold, rigid spine I had been building for the last 4 months. I did not need to make a scene. I just needed to set the stage and let the undeniable truth speak for itself. On the second Tuesday of May, I drafted my official letter of resignation. I did not use the colorful floral stationery my mother preferred for family correspondence. I printed the document on heavy ivory bond paper using the stark professional letterhead provided by my consulting attorney. The text was completely devoid of emotion or familial warmth. I formally resigned as the treasurer of the foundation effective immediately. I attached a sweeping legal notice to the board of directors and the primary donor contacts. In the second paragraph, I explicitly stated that I would not authorize any backdated financial filings. I stated clearly that I would not amend or correct any previously falsified operational ledgers, including the fraudulent public relations expenditures my sister had initiated. I absolved myself of all fiduciary responsibility for any actions taken by the foundation after the precise timestamp printed on the postage. I signed my name, sealed the heavy envelopes, and sent them via certified mail with signature confirmation required. The legal trap was officially set. 2 days later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived in my home mailbox. It was the formal invitation to the Grand Summer Gala. This event was my mother's absolute masterpiece, serving a highly calculated dual purpose. It was designed to publicly celebrate my parents' 35th wedding anniversary while simultaneously operating as the primary fundraising mechanism for their tax-exempt foundation. By all historical precedents, my receipt of this invitation should have been my immediate cue to drive to their house in Prairie Village and begin organizing the caterers. I simply sent my mother a brief text message confirming my attendance. In their deeply flawed reality, they interpreted my simple confirmation as a total surrender. Laurel assumed her prodigal daughter had finally softened and come back to the fold. Piper assumed I was preparing to swoop in at the 11th hour to fix all the administrative disasters she had ignored for months. Randall simply assumed the natural, comfortable order of the universe had finally been restored. Their delusions became increasingly apparent as the event drew closer. Laurel sent me a panicked audio message begging me to finalize the complex seating chart, because the local mayor and his wife required a specific table placement near the podium. I listened to her anxious voice and then deleted the message without responding. Piper forwarded a massive spreadsheet containing the vital donor packet logistics, demanding that I print and assemble 200 heavy presentation folders before Friday. I sent the file straight to my digital trash bin. I did not edit my father's anniversary speech. I did not confirm the dietary restrictions with the expensive private chef. I did not manage the complex floral delivery schedule. I let their urgent demands float into a silent void, leaving them to face the terrifying reality of their own incompetence. I was attending the gala, but I was strictly an invited guest. While they scrambled to maintain their perfect facade, I spent my evenings in the quiet basement of the Crossfield Arts Warehouse, preparing my own highly specific contribution to the evening. I was curating a miniature photography exhibition. I titled the collection, "Who Was Holding the Camera?" I spent dozens of hours sorting through old family archives and my newly developed rolls of black and white film. I carefully selected images that documented my entire existence as the invisible caretaker. There was a grainy photograph from a Thanksgiving dinner 10 years ago, showing the perfectly arranged dining table, the roasted turkey and the laughing family members, but completely omitting the person who had cooked and styled the entire scene. There was a candid shot from the lavish wedding of my sister showing only my hands adjusting the heavy silk train of her dress, while the rest of my body was entirely cropped out of the frame. There were images of expensive wrapped gifts resting on polished tables, their decorative seals completely unbroken by the recipients. I interspersed these deeply personal family artifacts with the stark architectural images I had captured over the spring. I included photographs of empty train stations, forgotten concrete overpasses, and vacant diner booths. The juxtaposition created a powerful, devastating visual testimony. The beautiful but desolate city spaces perfectly mirrored the hollow reality of my lifelong role within the family. I laid the prints out on the large wooden work tables in the warehouse. Colette walked slowly up and down the rows, inspecting every single frame. She was merciless in her professional critique. She forced me to remove 3 photographs that she felt were too emotionally manipulative. She told me to cut anything that looked like I was begging the audience for sympathy. She reiterated her previous advice, reminding me that the truth does not need to shout. It only needs to stand perfectly still and let the viewer absorb the quiet, undeniable impact. Once the final sequence was established, Theo helped me mount the photographs. We worked in a comfortable, companionable silence, surrounded by the sharp smell of cut wood and strong dark coffee. We chose simple matte black frames with wide white borders, ensuring there was absolutely nothing to distract from the subject matter. Theo handled the delicate prints with a level of profound respect and care that my own parents had never afforded me. He meticulously measured the mounting wire and ensured every single corner was perfectly flush. As we stacked the finished pieces into the back of my sedan, I felt a deep sense of closure. The visual record of my long erasure was finally complete and ready for public display. There was, however, one final piece of the exhibition that I did not frame and did not show to Theo or Colette. It was the absolute anchor of the entire collection. I kept it safely locked inside the trunk of my car, wrapped in a soft cloth. It was the physical vintage camera itself. I planned to place the heavy metal body directly next to the original handwritten card I had penned last year. There was no need to photograph it. The physical objects possessed an undeniable weight and reality that a two-dimensional image could never capture. It was the simplest and sharpest piece of evidence I possessed. It was the exact catalyst that had initiated this entire awakening, and it deserved to be the final silent punctuation mark on the evening. On the Friday evening before the gala, I sat on my living room sofa drinking a cup of hot tea. The house was entirely quiet. My phone illuminated on the coffee table, buzzing softly against the wood. I watched the screen display my father's name. I did not answer the call. I let the phone ring until the system diverted the connection to my automated greeting. A few minutes later, a small notification appeared indicating a new voicemail. I placed my teacup on the saucer and pressed play. The voice of my father filled the room, sounding slightly fatigued, but carrying his usual undertone of entitled expectation. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not mention the certified legal letters that had undoubtedly landed on his heavy mahogany desk. He simply cleared his throat and asked a single question. He asked if I could arrive a few hours early tomorrow to help make sure everything runs smoothly. I listened to the recording a second time, letting his arrogant words wash over me. He still did not understand the gravity of the situation. He had received a formal legal resignation. He was facing an impending state financial audit. I had completely withdrawn my labor and my presence from his life for months. Yet he still fundamentally believed that I existed solely to absorb the friction in his world. He believed that when the lights went down and the wealthy guests arrived, I would automatically revert to my designated function as the family shield. I deleted the voicemail and set the phone down. A cold, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. He was walking directly into a burning building and asking me to adjust the thermostat. I turned off the living room lights, went upstairs, and set my alarm for the morning. The stage was set. The evidence was meticulously catalogued, and the invisible daughter was finally ready to step out of the shadows. The evening air was thick with the scent of roasted cedar and blooming jasmine when I pulled into the gravel driveway of Ashgrove Barn. The venue was a massive, meticulously restored agricultural structure situated about 40 miles outside the city limits. It was the exact type of boutique event space that catered exclusively to wealthy suburbanites who wanted their luxury to look rustic and effortless. Thousands of warm white string lights were draped across the exposed wooden rafters, casting a soft golden glow over the immaculate white floral arrangements and the crystal wine glasses lining the tables. It was an environment precision engineered for people who cared deeply about projecting the image of a decent, highly successful American family. I walked through the heavy double doors and immediately spotted them holding court in the center of the room. They were putting on the performance of a lifetime. Piper was gliding through the crowd of deep-pocketed donors, wearing an emerald green silk gown, acting as the undisputed matriarch of the foundation. She laughed brightly, touching the arms of local politicians and nodding sympathetically, as if she carried the weight of the entire philanthropic world on her shoulders. Laurel was buzzing around the perimeter of the room, frantically adjusting the placement of linen napkins and whispering harsh instructions to the catering staff. Randall stood near the premium open bar, surrounded by a circle of other affluent men in tailored navy suits, accepting their firm handshakes and hearty congratulations. He looked every inch the proud patriarch, the symbol of a perfectly ordered and prosperous dynasty. I stepped into the warm light of the barn wearing a sharply tailored minimalist black suit. I wore no jewelry and carried only a small leather clutch. Tucked under my arms were the heavy matte black frames I had assembled the night before. I had barely crossed the threshold when a young, frantic event coordinator wearing a wireless earpiece rushed up to me. She took one look at my severe black clothing and my purposeful stride, and immediately assumed I was the missing backstage manager. Without missing a beat, she forcefully shoved a heavy wooden clipboard into my chest and ordered me to go check on the delayed appetizer service. For 32 years, my hands would have instinctively closed around that clipboard. I would have taken the order, rushed to the kitchen, and solved the problem before the guests even knew an issue existed. Tonight I simply kept my arms pinned to my sides and let the clipboard fall. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, sharp clatter that cut through the smooth ambient jazz playing over the speakers. The young woman gasped, stepping back in shock. I looked at her calmly and informed her that I was an invited guest. I did not apologize for the confusion. I simply stepped over the fallen wood and continued walking toward the designated welcome area. Instead of taking a seat at my assigned table, I moved toward a blank section of the rustic wooden wall positioned deliberately near the main entrance. Using a set of brass easel stands I had brought from my car, I silently arranged my miniature photography exhibition. I set up the frames without asking for permission or consulting the official event map. Once the collection was displayed, I stepped back and took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. I did not have to wait long for the atmosphere in the room to shift. The official foundation welcome display, a glossy, highly produced table featuring overly retouched photographs of Piper handing out oversized checks, was positioned just a few feet away. But human beings are naturally drawn to authenticity, especially when it starkly contrasts with manufactured corporate joy. Within 20 minutes, a small crowd had gathered around my easels. The guests, expecting to see more promotional materials instead, found themselves staring at a visual autopsy of a family. They stood in complete silence, holding their expensive glasses of Cabernet, looking at the stark black and white images of my invisible labor. They saw the empty chairs, the discarded ribbons, and the cold, lonely architecture of the city. I watched from a distance as a prominent local judge adjusted his glasses, leaning in close to examine a photograph of a perfectly decorated dining room, completely devoid of human warmth. I saw the wives of wealthy developers exchanging confused, uncomfortable glances. The images were undeniably beautiful, but they carried a profound, heavy sadness that completely contradicted the celebratory mood of the gala. People were lingering in front of my work, mesmerized by the quiet tragedy of it all. As the crowd around the photos thickened, I noticed a senior partner from a major regional wealth management firm approaching Piper and Laurel near the bar. I knew this man by reputation. He was a primary financial backer of the foundation, and he was notoriously strict about regulatory compliance. I drifted slightly closer, blending into the crowd, until I was within earshot of their conversation. The older gentleman smiled politely and congratulated them on the beautiful evening. Then he casually swirled the amber liquid in his glass and mentioned the certified legal notice he had received earlier that week. He looked directly at Piper and asked a very simple administrative question. He wanted to know who would be handling the compliance and tax oversight now that Emery had officially resigned from the board. The physical reaction was instantaneous and utterly devastating. Piper froze, her carefully curated smile stretching so tight it looked like her jaw might snap. She let out a loud, shrill laugh that was entirely too forceful for the quiet question. A thick bead of sweat instantly materialized at her hairline. She stammered, waving her hand dismissively, and claimed they were simply in a minor transitional phase. Laurel immediately panicked. Her eyes darted around the room in sheer terror, before she abruptly grabbed the arm of the wealthy donor and aggressively pivoted the conversation loudly, asking him about his recent golf trip to Florida. The older gentleman politely indulged my mother, but his eyes remained sharp and calculating. He glanced over Piper's shoulder directly at me, standing a few feet away. He offered a brief, respectful nod. In that single silent exchange, a crucial piece of the facade crumbled. Several other guests standing nearby had overheard the awkward, panicked exchange. Whispers began to ripple through the elegantly dressed crowd. People were finally starting to understand that I was not hovering in the background managing the logistics. I was not there in my traditional capacity as the endlessly useful and silently suffering daughter. The tension in the massive room continued to stretch, pulling tighter and tighter like a wire about to snap. At 8 o'clock, the string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The catering staff moved to the edges of the room, and Piper strode confidently up to the front podium. She tapped the microphone, sending a sharp whine of feedback through the barn. She began to deliver her keynote speech. It was a masterclass in hollow corporate philanthropy, heavily peppered with buzzwords about family bonds, community synergy, and selfless dedication. As she neared the end of her prepared remarks, she attempted to pull off a classic public relations maneuver. She decided to publicly acknowledge the family members who made her success possible, attempting to weave a narrative of absolute domestic unity. She thanked our parents for their unwavering guidance. Then she turned her gaze toward the back of the room, searching for me in the crowd. When she found me standing near my photographs, she offered a wide, generous smile. She leaned into the microphone and told the 200 assembled guests that she wanted to give a special acknowledgement to her older sister, Emery. She called me the rock of the household, the one who always keeps things tidy and neat for the family behind the scenes. She delivered the line as if throwing a scrap of meat to a starving dog, expecting me to lower my head and humbly accept the meager praise. She expected me to smile politely and validate her illusion of a perfect, loving sisterhood. She genuinely believed that calling me tidy in front of an audience would instantly patch up decades of profound exploitation. The room erupted into polite, obligatory applause. Every head in the barn turned to look at me, expecting a modest wave or a shy smile. I did not smile. I did not wave. I set my glass of sparkling water down on a nearby cocktail table. The applause slowly died out, awkwardly trailing off into a heavy, suffocating silence as the guests realized I was not participating in the expected social script. I looked straight across the room, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my sister standing at the podium. I did not raise my voice to a shout, but I projected my words with the practiced clarity of a woman who had spent years speaking in crowded boardrooms. I looked at Piper and said simply, "Not anymore." The two words cut through the cavernous wooden barn like a hunting knife. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. You could hear the faint hum of the industrial refrigerators in the catering kitchen. A woman in the front row nervously cleared her throat. The entire space had not completely detonated yet, but every single person holding a glass of wine could feel the undeniable vibration of something massive and incredibly real rising up through the floorboards. The polished veneer of the Davis Promise Foundation was cracking right in front of their eyes. Laurel stood frozen near the dessert table, a look of sheer, unadulterated horror washing over her meticulously powdered face. Randall gripped the edge of the bar, his knuckles turning completely white, his jaw clenched in furious disbelief. Piper stood at the podium, her mouth slightly open, the microphone picking up her suddenly ragged breathing. For the very first time in their carefully curated lives, my family realized the agonizing truth. They realized that the silent, reliable machine they had built their entire world upon had not just stopped working. The machine was looking right back at them, and it was finally demanding to be paid. The suffocating silence that followed my quiet refusal hung in the barn for several agonizing seconds. The polished facade of the evening was completely fractured, but the absolute breaking point arrived from the crowd itself. The senior partner from the wealth management firm, the man who had questioned Piper near the bar, decided he was done playing along with the charade. He took a deliberate step forward, separating himself from the wealthy donors, and raised his voice so it carried across the entire room. He publicly thanked me, addressing me formally as the treasurer of the foundation, and then he asked a very calm but highly lethal question. He asked me to clarify my stance on the newly amended financial filings and the sudden retroactive authorizations attached to my signature. In that precise moment, I knew exactly what was happening. If I remained silent, if I turned around and simply walked out the door, my family would immediately spin a narrative to save themselves. They would tell the entire room that I was having a mental breakdown, that I was confused, and they would quietly use my silence as a blanket confirmation of their fraudulent paperwork. I would once again be forced into the role of the silent beast of burden, carrying the heavy consequences of their endless vanity. I did not turn around. I walked deliberately toward the front of the room. The sea of elegantly dressed guests instinctively parted for me. I stepped up onto the low wooden stage and approached the podium. Piper was standing there frozen, and I simply looked at her until she took a shaky step backward, relinquishing her absolute control of the microphone. I leaned forward. I did not yell. My voice was incredibly calm and steady, which made it infinitely more terrifying to the people who knew me. Anger implies a loss of control, but my voice was the sound of absolute, unwavering conviction. I spoke directly to the room. I announced clearly that I had officially resigned from my position on the board several weeks ago. I stated unequivocally that I did not approve the recent operational filings, and I would not allow my name, my reputation, or my professional credentials to be used to legitimize financial actions I did not take. The vast wooden barn fell so quiet that you could hear the evening breeze rustling the leaves of the oak trees outside. Piper immediately tried to execute a desperate damage control maneuver. She stepped forward, reaching for the microphone stand, forcing a loud hysterical laugh, and telling the crowd that sisters always have these silly administrative miscommunications. From the side of the room, Laurel rushed toward the stage, her face entirely drained of color, aggressively, waving her hands and begging me to step down so we could discuss family business in private later. They were still desperately trying to rewrite the situation to pull the curtain shut and drag me back into the dark. I did not let them. I kept my hand firmly gripped around the microphone stand, anchoring myself to the stage. I looked at the crowd and told them that the fraudulent paperwork was merely a symptom of a much deeper decay. I reached into the oversized pocket of my dark blazer and pulled out the heavy vintage camera. The metal body caught the warm, ambient light of the string bulbs overhead. I walked down the 2 short steps from the stage and approached the primary table where my father was standing. I looked Randall directly in the eyes. I told the completely silent room about the morning of Christmas. I told them how I had spent months searching for the exact camera my father had always wanted. I explained the cost, the effort, and the profound love I had poured into that single gift. Then I explained how he had wrapped that exact same camera 12 months later and handed it back to me with my own handwritten card still resting entirely unread inside the canvas pocket. I placed the heavy silver and black camera directly onto the white linen tablecloth right in front of his empty wine glass. I laid the small handwritten card beside it. The objects hit the table with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like a final gavel strike. I did not exaggerate the story. I did not cry. I laid the physical evidence of his profound neglect in front of him like an unsealable indictment. I then turned my attention to the final easel standing near the entrance of the barn. Throughout the evening, it had remained covered by a simple black cloth. I walked over and pulled the fabric away. It was the absolute final piece of my photography exhibition. It was a stark black and white self-portrait. I had taken it by capturing my own reflection in the cracked glass of an abandoned storefront window. It was the very first image in my entire life where I was not standing behind the lens, where my hands were not adjusting someone else, where I was not cropped out of the frame. I was standing tall, looking directly back at the viewer. I turned back to my family and delivered my final resignation. I told them I was no longer serving as the invisible memory bank for their lives. I was no longer the silent administrator operating in the background. I was no longer the convenient name they could forge on legal documents when they made mistakes. Most importantly, I told them I was no longer the daughter they could safely ignore because they assumed I would eventually just endure the disappointment. Piper slammed her hands onto the podium, her polished veneer completely shattering into raw, childish anger. She screamed that I was ruining everything and that I had deliberately chosen the worst possible time to throw a selfish tantrum. I looked at my sister and delivered the coldest, truest sentence of the entire evening. I told her that my speaking up was certainly inconvenient for her tonight, but her exploitation of my life had been going on for over 30 years. The crushing weight of the entire room converged on my father. He was completely cornered, surrounded by the wealthy peers and influential friends whose opinions he valued more than his own flesh and blood. The meticulously crafted image of his perfect patriarchal authority was lying in absolute ruins on the floor. He looked at the vintage camera resting on the table, and his shoulders finally collapsed. The arrogance drained out of him, leaving an old, hollow man. In a weak, trembling voice, he finally confessed the cruelest truth I had ever heard. He admitted that I was always the one child he thought would never cause him any trouble. He confessed that because I was so capable, they just naturally let me absorb all the difficult, invisible burdens so they could focus on the brighter, easier things. I looked at the man who had broken my heart 1,000 times and told him the ultimate tragedy of his logic. I told him that exactly because I had stopped causing trouble for so long, he had completely forgotten how to look at me and see a living, breathing human being. I did not wait for an apology. I did not wait for the stunned guests to begin murmuring again. I turned my back on the podium, on the beautiful floral arrangements, and on the people who had created this suffocating world. I walked straight out the heavy double doors of the barn and stepped into the cool, crisp night air. I left them entirely behind. I left the corrupt foundation, the dirty administrative files, the pending state audit, and the utterly shattered family image to the exact people who had built them. The payoff arrived slowly over the following weeks. The truth, as Colette had promised, did exactly what it was supposed to do. A significant portion of the major donors formally withdrew their financial support from the Davis Promise Foundation, citing a sudden lack of administrative transparency. However, several of those same wealthy individuals quietly reached out to me. They offered their substantial financial backing to launch a brand new community arts program that Colette and I were establishing in the city. Piper completely lost her glittering stage. Her boutique closed its doors and her social standing evaporated. Laurel was permanently forced to reside in a reality that she could no longer orchestrate or control with expensive centerpieces. 2 months later, a small plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a single torn piece of lined paper bearing the familiar handwriting of my father. There was no long apology and no demand for reconciliation. The note contained only 2 sentences. I saw you too late, but I see you now. I read the words sitting at my kitchen table. I did not pick up the phone to call him. I did not drive to Prairie Village to patch the gaping holes in their lives. I took the small piece of paper and tucked it carefully inside the canvas bag of the vintage camera, which now sat permanently on my living room bookshelf. I had finally stopped waiting for them to invite me into their picture. I picked up my car keys and walked out the door, stepping into the bright morning sun. For the very first time in my existence, I was walking forward without needing anyone to give me permission to be completely visible in the frame of my own life. Thank you so much for listening to the story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support further by hitting the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.